Late August 1944, northern France. The road does not sleep. Headlights cut thin tunnels through dust and darkness. Engines growl at a constant pitch, neither fast nor slow, just relentless. Truck after truck rolls forward, tires humming over broken pavement, canvas sides snapping in the night air. Men grip steering wheels with hands stiff from hours of vibration, eyes fixed on the white edge lines that mark a single purpose: keep moving. Somewhere ahead, tanks idle with empty bellies. Artillery waits for shells that have not yet arrived. Infantry units pause on the edge of villages already half abandoned by the enemy, uncertain whether tomorrow brings momentum or a halt. Victory is visible, but fragile. Behind the front, German commanders study maps and reports. They know the distances. They know the ports are wrecked, the railways shattered, the supply lines stretched thin. They expect the advance to choke on its own speed. Armies, they believe, cannot outrun logistics. But on this road, that assumption is being tested mile by mile. Fuel drums clatter in truck beds. Convoys stretch back toward the coast, then loop forward again without pause. This is not a battle marked by gunfire or flags, but by tonnage, timing, and endurance. And as the engines keep turning, the fate of an entire front begins to hinge on whether this road can carry enough to keep the war moving forward. From breakout to pursuit. By the third week of August 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered a phase few Allied planners had dared to predict on the original Normandy timetables. The beachhead was no longer a question of survival. It had exploded outward. Operation Cobra, launched in late July, had ruptured the German defensive line in Normandy. American ground forces poured through the gap. Entire enemy formations collapsed or fled. Paris would be liberated on August 25. By early September, Allied spearheads were racing toward Belgium, the German border, and the Rhine, territory planners once assumed would take months to reach. On maps, it looked like triumph. On supply ledgers, it looked like danger. The Allied invasion had been designed around ports, railheads, and carefully staged logistics zones. None of those assumptions survived the speed of the advance. The ports closest to Normandy, Cherbourg above all, had been heavily damaged. German demolition teams had wrecked cranes, docks, and rail connections before retreating. Southern ports remained out of reach. Railways across France lay twisted and cratered from years of Allied bombing meant to paralyze German movement, not support an Allied pursuit. The front had moved hundreds of miles in weeks. The supply system had not. Modern armies do not move on courage alone. A mechanized force consumes fuel at a scale that defies intuition. Tanks burn gasoline even while idling. Trucks require constant resupply just to deliver resupply. Artillery does not ration shells during a breakthrough. Infantry divisions, though lighter, still demand food, medical supplies, ammunition, and replacements at a relentless pace. In Normandy, those needs could be met. Distances were short. Beach depots were stocked in advance. Pipelines ran inland. But once the breakout occurred, every mile gained multiplied the logistical problem. Supplies now had to travel from the coast of France to the forward edge of battle, sometimes over 300 miles, on roads never intended to carry such weight, volume, or traffic density. Commanders at the front felt the strain first. Units that had momentum one day found themselves halted the next, not by German resistance, but by empty fuel tanks. Tanks sat silent behind hedgerows, crews listening to distant fighting they could not reach. Artillery officers counted shells with growing caution. Infantry advanced only as far as their supporting arms could follow. At the highest level, Allied leadership faced a dilemma created by success. The enemy was reeling. German formations were retreating faster than expected, often abandoning equipment and positions without prolonged fighting. This was the moment to press. Yet every push forward widened the gap between the combat units and the supply bases sustaining them. The German High Command understood this vulnerability. Their own experience on the Eastern Front had taught them the limits of motorized warfare without fuel. They knew that speed was expensive. They also knew the Allies lacked functioning ports close to the front and that rail reconstruction would take time. From their perspective, the Allied advance was impressive, but unsustainable. The assumption was logical. Armies that move too fast usually stall. The question was not if the Americans would stop, but where. Behind the scenes, Allied logisticians were already confronting the arithmetic of crisis. Daily supply requirements climbed sharply with every mile gained. Fuel alone became decisive. An armored division could consume tens of thousands of gallons per day. Multiply that across multiple armies, all advancing simultaneously, and the numbers became staggering. Traditional solutions, rail transport, pipelines, port offloading, could not be expanded fast enough. Something temporary, aggressive, and unprecedented would be required to bridge the gap between the beaches and the front. And that realization, born not from defeat but from dangerous success, set the stage for a logistical experiment that would soon determine whether the Allied advance continued, or ground to a halt on the roads of France. The birth of an emergency artery. The solution did not emerge from doctrine manuals or pre-war planning tables. It emerged from necessity, and from the recognition that conventional logistics had already failed to keep pace with victory. By late August 1944, Allied logisticians were facing a simple but unforgiving reality. The war was being won faster than it could be supplied. Rail reconstruction units worked continuously, but bridges were down, rail yards wrecked, and locomotives scarce. Pipelines from the Normandy beaches extended only so far and required time, materials, and security to push forward. Ports that planners had counted on, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, remained in German hands or lay in ruins once captured. Meanwhile, the front continued to move. General Dwight D. Eisenhower insisted on maintaining pressure across a broad front. The strategic logic was sound. Keeping all Allied armies advancing prevented the Germans from concentrating their remaining strength. But this approach magnified logistical strain. Supplies could not simply be shifted from one spearhead to another without consequence. Every formation demanded fuel at once. By August 25, the day Paris was liberated, it became clear that a temporary system was required, one that ignored peacetime efficiency and focused solely on volume and speed. The answer was brutally straightforward: trucks. Thousands of them. The U.S. Army had something no other combatant possessed in comparable numbers: motor vehicles. American industry had produced trucks on a scale that dwarfed European standards. They were not elegant. They were not fast. But they were numerous, reliable, and simple to maintain. And they could operate without rails, ports, or pipelines. Within days, planners authorized an emergency convoy network designed to bypass normal procedures entirely. It would operate around the clock. It would have absolute priority on designated roads. And it would deliver one thing above all others: fuel. The system was named the Red Ball Express, borrowing a railroad term used to describe priority freight. The symbolism was deliberate. These supplies were not optional. They were mission-critical. The first convoys rolled on August 25, 1944. Routes were marked with red discs, red balls, to guide drivers and signal traffic police. Certain roads were closed to all other vehicles. One-way loops were created to keep trucks moving continuously, reducing congestion and confusion. A loaded convoy moved forward. An empty convoy returned by a separate route. There were no rest days built into the schedule. At its peak, the Red Ball Express involved nearly 6,000 vehicles and tens of thousands of personnel. Drivers often operated for days with minimal sleep, stopping only for refueling, basic maintenance, or brief meals grabbed beside the road. Trucks broke down at alarming rates. Tires shredded. Engines overheated. Accidents were frequent, sometimes fatal. But the convoys kept moving. Much of this burden fell on African American units of the U.S. Army Transportation Corps. In a segregated force that often denied them combat recognition, these soldiers were assigned one of the most physically demanding and strategically essential missions of the campaign. They drove through darkness, dust, rain, and shellfire, not to fight the enemy directly, but to ensure others could. The German command initially viewed the situation with confidence. They understood logistics. They knew the distances involved. They assumed truck transport could never sustain an entire front for long. From their perspective, the Allied advance was living on borrowed time. What they did not yet grasp was that this improvised system was not meant to be elegant or permanent. It was meant to be overwhelming. And as fuel began to flow forward in quantities few thought possible, the question shifted, from whether the advance could be sustained, to how long the enemy could endure the pressure created by a road that never stopped delivering. Angle 1: The tactical reality of speed. Speed was the defining weapon of the Allied advance in late summer 1944, but speed came with a cost that could not be negotiated or delayed. Every mile gained stretched the distance between the front and the supply depots behind it. What appeared on maps as a bold arrow pointing east was, in practice, a fragile chain of fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts that could snap at any weak point. American armored doctrine relied on momentum. Tanks were meant to exploit breakthroughs, not pause to consolidate ground inch by inch. But a tank without fuel was not a weapon, it was a stationary liability. By early September, some U.S. units found themselves advancing by day and immobilized by night, waiting for gasoline that had not yet arrived. German commanders understood this vulnerability. In their own campaigns, stalled advances often began with empty fuel drums rather than enemy fire. They believed the Americans were repeating the same mistake, pushing too far, too fast. The expectation was not that U.S. forces would be defeated outright, but that they would be forced to pause, giving German units time to regroup, entrench, and stabilize a collapsing front. Instead, the pause never fully came. The Red Ball Express changed the tactical equation. It did not eliminate shortages, but it narrowed the gap just enough to keep key formations moving. A single convoy arriving at the right moment could mean the difference between a stalled division and a renewed push. Fuel deliveries were prioritized over almost everything else, reinforcing the principle that movement itself was the battlefield advantage. In this sense, the Red Ball Express was not merely supporting combat, it was shaping it. The road behind the front became as tactically significant as the ground ahead. And as long as fuel reached the spearheads, German hopes of an operational pause began to erode. That realization would only deepen as the system proved it could do more than merely delay a halt, it could sustain an advance. Angle 2, industrial power turned into motion. The Red Ball Express was not a miracle. It was an expression of industrial reality. The United States entered the war with an unmatched capacity to produce vehicles. By 1944, American factories were turning out trucks in numbers that transformed logistics from a supporting function into a decisive capability. These were not luxury machines. They were standardized, rugged, and designed for mass use, vehicles meant to be driven hard, repaired quickly, and replaced without hesitation. This mattered because logistics is ultimately an industrial problem disguised as a military one. Germany could plan brilliant operations, but it could not manufacture fuel, trucks, or spare parts at the scale required to sustain them. The Allies, by contrast, could afford inefficiency if it delivered volume. The Red Ball Express embraced that philosophy. Trucks were driven beyond recommended limits. Maintenance schedules were ignored when necessary. Vehicles were cannibalized to keep others running. Where was accepted as the price of speed? From a purely mechanical standpoint, the system was wasteful. From a strategic standpoint, it was devastatingly effective. Each truck represented a fragment of American industrial power converted directly into forward motion. Steel, rubber, gasoline, and labor, manufactured thousands of miles away, were now arriving at the front in tangible form. The Germans could destroy bridges and rail yards, but they could not easily stop thousands of independent vehicles spreading across an entire road network. What looked improvised was, in fact, the natural extension of an economy built for scale. The Red Ball Express did not defeat German forces by itself, but it ensured that those who did had the means to continue. And that industrial momentum, once unleashed, proved difficult for the enemy to counter. Angle 3, human endurance on the road. Behind every statistic was a driver who rarely saw the front but felt the war in other ways, through exhaustion, strain, and repetition. Drivers slept beside their trucks or not at all. They drove through blackout conditions, guided only by painted markers and tail lights ahead. Dust coated their lungs and uniforms. Rain turned roads into slick hazards. Accidents were common, often caused by fatigue rather than enemy action. There was little glory in the work. No cheering crowds. No captured flags. Just another load, another run, another night. Many of these drivers understood the irony of their role. In a segregated army that limited their opportunities, they were entrusted with one of the most essential missions of the campaign. Failure on their part would not merely inconvenience commanders, it would stall the advance of entire armies. They measured success not in territory gained, but in miles completed without breakdown. In convoys that arrived intact. In engines that started one more time. The Red Ball Express demanded endurance as much as courage. It required men who could keep going when the task seemed endless, invisible, and thankless. And as those men continued to drive, mile after mile, the consequences of their effort were being felt far ahead, on battlefields where movement continued, resistance crumbled, and German expectations quietly collapsed. Angle 4, leadership under logistical pressure. At the highest levels of command, the Red Ball Express was never viewed as an elegant solution. It was a compromise born of pressure, and leadership understood both its necessity and its risks. General Eisenhower's insistence on a broad front advance placed extraordinary demands on logistics. Supplying one spearhead aggressively was difficult enough. Supplying several simultaneously, each consuming fuel at different rates, across widening distances, pushed the system to its limits. Every gallon sent to one army was a gallon not sent elsewhere. Every truck assigned to fuel was one less available for ammunition, rations, or medical supplies. Commanders argued constantly over priorities. Armored units demanded gasoline. Infantry divisions requested food and ammunition. Engineers needed materials to repair roads and bridges that the convoys themselves were destroying through sheer weight and repetition. There was no perfect answer, only trade-offs. The Red Ball Express allowed leadership to delay the most dangerous decision of all, choosing which armies would advance and which would pause. As long as the convoys flowed, Eisenhower could maintain pressure everywhere. The system bought time to repair ports, rebuild railways, and extend pipelines forward. Yet leadership also knew the system could not last indefinitely. Vehicles were wearing out faster than they could be repaired. Drivers were approaching exhaustion. Road congestion worsened with every additional convoy. The Red Ball Express was not a foundation, it was a bridge. And while it held, it allowed Allied command to keep the enemy off balance, denying them the operational pause they desperately needed. Angle 5, the enemy's miscalculation. From the German perspective, the Allied advance defied familiar logic. German commanders had long believed that motorized armies were limited by fuel above all else. Their own experience had taught them that even victorious offensives could collapse when supply lines stretched too far. They expected the Americans to face the same fate, particularly without functioning ports or railways close to the front. Initial intelligence reports seemed to confirm their assumptions. Allied fuel shortages were real. Units paused. Advance timetables slipped. German planners interpreted these signs as the beginning of an inevitable slowdown. What they failed to grasp was the scale of American improvisation. The Red Ball Express did not conform to traditional European logistical models. It did not rely on fixed depots or centralized rail distribution. It flooded the roads with vehicles, overwhelming inefficiency with volume. German air power, once capable of disrupting such movement, was no longer strong enough to do so. Interdiction efforts were sporadic and largely ineffective. As days passed and the Allied advance continued, German confidence eroded. Reports described American units resuming movement when fuel was expected to run out. German commanders began to realize that the logistical pause they were counting on was not materializing. The mockery faded quietly. There was no single moment of recognition, just a growing understanding that the Americans were feeding their advance in a way Germany could no longer match or disrupt. Angle 6, the moral weight of an invisible victory. The Red Ball Express exposed a contradiction at the heart of the American war effort. On one hand, it represented everything the United States did best: industrial scale, adaptability, and the ability to turn resources into sustained action. On the other, it relied heavily on soldiers who served in a segregated army, denied the recognition and opportunity afforded to others. African American drivers carried one of the war's most decisive burdens without the public acknowledgement given to combat units. Their success was measured only in continued movement that others took credit for at the front. Yet history would later recognize that without their endurance, the advance across France would have slowed, stalled, or fractured. The road they drove became a battlefield of its own, one without gunfire but no less decisive. This moral complexity did not diminish the achievement, it deepened it. The Red Ball Express was not merely a logistical triumph. It was a human one, built on labor, sacrifice, and persistence rather than spectacle. And as the system continued to push fuel forward, the war approached a moment when the question would no longer be whether the advance could continue, but whether the enemy could withstand an offensive powered by a supply line that refused to break. When the advance should have stopped. By early September 1944, the Allied advance reached the point where theory said it should fail. Fuel shortages were no longer abstract figures on planning charts. They were being felt in real time at the front. Armored columns paused on open roads with engines shut down to conserve gasoline. Reconnaissance units reported opportunities they could not exploit. Commanders calculated movement not in miles, but in remaining gallons. In several sectors, German resistance stiffened, not because the enemy had regained strength, but because Allied momentum faltered just enough to give them breathing room. The risk was clear. If the advance paused too long, German forces could reorganize, establish defensive lines, and turn a retreat into a stand. This was the moment German commanders had been waiting for. From their perspective, the Americans had reached the outer edge of sustainability. The distances from the Normandy beaches were extreme. The ports were still damaged. Rail lines remained unreliable. No modern army, they believed, could sustain full-scale operations under such conditions. The pause would come. It had to. But behind the front, something unprecedented was happening. The Red Ball Express shifted from emergency support to operational lifeline. Convoys were no longer just supplementing supply, they were becoming the primary means by which entire armies remained mobile. Fuel deliveries were rushed forward to advanced depots, sometimes within range of enemy artillery. Trucks arrived at all hours, unloading by flashlight, then turning around immediately for another run. The system operated on priority, not balance. Fuel went first. Ammunition followed when possible. Other supplies waited. This imbalance was dangerous, but leadership accepted the risk. Movement mattered more than comfort or even sustainability in the short term. In practical terms, this meant that certain U.S. formations, particularly armored and mechanized units, were kept just supplied enough to move again. Not to rest. Not to rebuild. But to advance. German commanders began to notice a troubling pattern. Units that appeared stalled one day resumed pressure the next. Expected pauses shortened. Opportunities to regroup vanished before they could be exploited. The front line behaved unpredictably, not because of brilliance at the tactical level, but because fuel kept appearing where it should not have. The road network behind the front had become a living system. Traffic control points enforced movement with near-military discipline. Drivers ignored speed limits. Convoys passed wrecked vehicles pushed to the roadside, abandoned not because they were useless, but because time mattered more than recovery. Each successful delivery postponed the pause German planners expected. Each convoy extended the life of the advance by another day. The climax was not marked by a single battle or dramatic confrontation. It unfolded quietly, in spreadsheets, fuel dumps, and exhausted drivers climbing back into their cabs. And as the Red Ball Express continued to feed the front, it became clear that the moment when the Allied advance should have stopped, had passed. When the road rewrote the war. The decisive change did not announce itself with explosions or captured headquarters. It revealed itself through continuity, through the simple, unsettling fact that the Allied advance kept going. By mid-September 1944, the Red Ball Express had crossed the line from emergency measure to strategic fact. What German planners had assumed would be a temporary improvisation proved capable of sustaining pressure far longer than expected. Day after day, convoys arrived. Fuel dumps were replenished just enough to keep engines turning. Orders that might once have been cancelled for lack of supply were executed instead. This was the moment when German mockery ended, not with outrage or surprise, but with resignation. Commanders along the retreating front could no longer rely on American logistics to save them. Defensive positions were prepared and abandoned in rapid succession, not because they were breached, but because Allied forces arrived before those positions could be fully occupied. Movement itself became the enemy. Yet the system was showing signs of strain. Trucks were failing faster than replacements could arrive. Maintenance units worked continuously, stripping parts from damaged vehicles to keep others alive. Drivers operated at the edge of endurance, some driving nearly non-stop for days. Road surfaces deteriorated under constant traffic, creating bottlenecks that threatened to undo the entire effort. Leadership understood the danger. The Red Ball Express was not winning the war, it was buying time. Ports would have to be repaired. Railways rebuilt. Pipelines extended. Without those, the system would collapse under its own weight. But time was exactly what the Allies needed. Each additional day of movement denied the Germans the chance to re-establish coherent defensive lines. Each mile gained forced them to retreat toward borders already under pressure from other fronts. The psychological effect compounded the material one. German units came to expect pursuit without pause. Planning became reactive. Confidence eroded. The turning point, then, was not a single decision but a realization shared unevenly on both sides of the front. The Allies recognized that logistics could be pushed beyond traditional limits if the goal was clear and temporary. The Germans recognized that their assumptions about American sustainability were wrong. When the road proved it could feed an entire front, the balance of expectation shifted permanently. The Red Ball Express did not create victory, but it removed one of the last hopes the German command still held, that the Allied advance would exhaust itself before reaching decisive ground. And with that hope gone, the consequences of sustained movement would soon be measured in territory, collapse, and the approaching end of the campaign in Western Europe. What continuous movement achieved? When the Red Ball Express began to slow in the autumn of 1944, it did so not because it had failed, but because its purpose had been fulfilled. By the time the emergency system was scaled down, it had delivered an extraordinary volume of material, commonly cited at more than 400,000 tons of supplies over roughly 83 days of continuous operation. Fuel accounted for the largest share, followed by ammunition and essential material. These numbers were not abstract achievements. They translated directly into divisions that kept moving, artillery that continued firing, and armored units that remained operational when theory suggested they should have stopped. The most immediate consequence was operational continuity. The U.S. First and Third Armies, among others, were able to maintain pressure across a wide front during a period when normal logistics would have forced a pause. That pressure prevented German forces from consolidating defensive lines in central France and along key river barriers. Retreat became habitual. Withdrawal plans were revised again and again, often abandoned before they could be executed. This did not mean the Allies advanced without difficulty. Shortages persisted. Some units were favored while others waited. The Red Ball Express created winners and losers within the Allied order of battle, depending on priority and timing. But even uneven supply proved better than none at all. The system also reshaped Allied thinking. Logistics officers gained unprecedented influence over operations. Commanders who once focused primarily on maneuver and firepower now monitored tonnage tables and convoy flow with equal intensity. The war made clear that speed was not simply a tactical choice, it was a logistical achievement. The costs were significant. Thousands of vehicles were worn out beyond repair. Maintenance backlogs grew. Accidents claimed lives and equipment. Roads in northern France suffered damage that would take years to repair. The human toll on drivers, physical exhaustion, stress, and injury, was rarely recorded with the same precision as tonnage moved. Yet measured against the alternative, a stalled front, regained enemy cohesion, and prolonged fighting, the price was accepted without hesitation. Perhaps the most telling outcome was psychological. German commanders no longer planned on American exhaustion. The assumption that logistics would enforce a pause had been disproven. From this point forward, German strategy increasingly assumed relentless pressure, even when conditions seemed unfavorable. The Red Ball Express had not just supplied the advance. It had changed expectations, on both sides of the war. And as more permanent supply solutions finally came online, the emergency road system began to fade into the background, leaving behind a transformed campaign and a retreating enemy force to confront the full consequences of uninterrupted movement. Why the system ended, and what it left behind. By mid-November 1944, the Red Ball Express was no longer the only artery feeding the Allied advance. It had never been intended to last. It was a stopgap, brutal, inefficient, and costly, designed to hold the line between victory and paralysis until more permanent systems could catch up. Those systems were finally arriving. Ports along the French coast, though heavily damaged, were brought back into partial operation. Antwerp, captured intact in early September, became usable once the Scheldt estuary was cleared of German forces and mines. Rail repair units restored key lines, reconnecting inland depots to coastal supply hubs. Most importantly, fuel pipelines, quiet, invisible, and far more efficient than trucks, were pushed steadily forward. As these systems came online, the logic that had sustained the Red Ball Express began to reverse. Trucks that once delivered fuel were now needed elsewhere. Roads, battered by constant heavy traffic, became liabilities rather than assets. Vehicle attrition reached levels that could no longer be justified when alternatives existed. On or around November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially ceased operations after roughly 83 days. There was no ceremony. No declaration of success. The convoys simply thinned, then stopped. But the campaign they had enabled did not reverse. The territory gained during those weeks remained Allied ground. German forces, pushed back faster than anticipated, had lost cohesion they would never fully regain in the West. Defensive lines established later, along the Siegfried Line, in the Ardennes, were formed under pressure rather than preparation. The lessons were absorbed quickly. Allied planners recognized that logistics could no longer be treated as a secondary concern or a technical footnote. It was operational power. Future planning placed even greater emphasis on redundancy, flexibility, and scale. The idea that an army could be supplied by road on such a massive level became part of military thinking rather than an anomaly. For the men who drove the trucks, the end of the Red Ball Express brought little recognition at the time. They were reassigned, absorbed into other transport roles, or sent to support new advances. The road moved on without remembering their names. Yet the impact of their labor endured. The emergency system had proven that wars were not only decided by battles fought, but by systems sustained. That movement, continuous, unglamorous movement, could collapse enemy plans as effectively as firepower. When historians later traced the speed of the Allied advance across France, they found that it was not just the collapse of German defenses that mattered. It was the refusal of Allied logistics to accept the limits that tradition imposed. And with the Red Ball Express gone, the war moved into its next phase, one built on the momentum it had helped create, and the irreversible realization that the road behind the front had become as decisive as the front itself. Wars are remembered by the moments that break the surface, battles named, cities liberated, lines crossed on maps. Yet beneath every decisive moment lies a quieter force, measured not in heroics but in consistency. The Red Ball Express did not fire a shot. It did not seize ground or capture an enemy banner. Its victories were counted in gallons delivered on time, in engines that kept turning when they should have gone silent, in hours gained before the enemy could recover. It proved that in modern war, momentum is not a gift of fortune, it is manufactured. What unfolded on the roads of France in 1944 was not improvisation in the romantic sense. It was discipline under strain. It was industrial power translated into motion. It was human endurance pushed to its limits in service of a goal few would ever see firsthand. The system worked not because it was efficient, but because it refused to stop when stopping seemed inevitable. For German commanders, the lesson was brutal. The pause they expected never came. The logistical collapse they waited for did not arrive. Instead, the Allies demonstrated a form of warfare Germany could no longer counter, one in which supply was not a vulnerability, but a weapon. For history, the meaning runs deeper. The Red Ball Express exposed the true anatomy of victory. It showed that the distance between ambition and achievement is often bridged by labor rather than strategy, by persistence rather than brilliance. The men who drove those roads did not shape history with grand decisions, but with repeated ones, mile after mile, night after night. When the engines finally went quiet and the convoys faded from memory, the front had already moved beyond them. Yet the war's direction had been set. Because in 1944, on roads no one planned to remember, an army learned that the power to advance did not come only from the front line, but from the unbroken line behind it, refusing to let the war slow down.